Please welcome from Microsoft, Eric Harlan.
I have not seen the show. I am completely lost at the entire last 30 minutes. But, you know, my wife and I, we actually just cut the cord, I guess is the best way to say it, not literally but figuratively with cable. So I was actually just talking about this with Mark, and he said, well, now it's on Netflix, so you can go back and binge watch it. But I don't know, man. I think I pretty much got the gist of it there. So. All right, so let me go through the formal stuff. Thanks for having me. I appreciate everybody being out here today. A little bit about me and what I do and all that good stuff as to why it sort of matters in this whole scheme about what we're about to talk about. So I am a premier field engineer, and essentially, like we were saying, what that means is when you've gone through the layers of support for Microsoft and you still haven't come to a resolution, or you pay an inordinate amount of sums of money to have someone come out and skip that whole process of going through those phone queues, that's someone like me. So when you have SharePoint issues, whether it be something is broken, something is down, mission critical, or you're just having a nagging issue, you can have someone like myself either come on site or on the phone and have some dedicated time to actually try to figure out what that is. So that's sort of the context in which I speak on my soapbox today, so hopefully that makes sense. Just a little bit about me really quick. I'm a new dad, so my travel has gone way down and my time at home has gone way up. Unfortunately, not enough up that I really enjoy. I like to spend more time at home, but we have types of things like this that we have to go out and speak at, so they all sort of weigh out in the end. A thrill seeker, currently unfulfilled. I think if you're a real thrill seeker, you're always really unfulfilled. That's the whole point. Whether it be jumping out of planes or climbing mountains, those are the things I really get a kick out of. Travel and SharePoint sort of is the vehicle to get me to those points. So if you see a post or something like that, if you start following me and it's a video of falling out of the sky at 160 miles an hour, that's Eric. So my wife, I'm actually from here originally, just north of here in Columbia, Maryland. And my wife and I, we just moved out to Texas. So we have what do they call a ranchette. It's kind of like a small ranch comparatively to what Texas size is used to. Here it's huge, so we have 14 acres out there. And I have embraced my closet redneck side. I have a four-wheeler now, which I always wanted a four-wheeler, and I've gotten it stuck in the creek quite a few times, or they call it crick there. So I've got it stuck in a crick a few times. But that's, you know, just a little bit about me. 30 minutes, we could probably talk an hour about any of the individual adventures that we all go on. So that's not really why we're here, and that's not really why it's important. But why are we here? So like I was saying, with being a PFE, you wouldn't be surprised if you know SharePoint, but you would be really shocked at some of the issues that we come into and some of the things that I've walked into in the past. And we'll get into a little bit about that. I don't want to give away all the stories, but I have quite a bit of stories. And I really want to start this talk with what we're about to talk about is common knowledge to everybody. Everyone knows you're supposed to be doing this. Everyone also knows you're supposed to be getting 8 hours of sleep. You're supposed to be saving away for retirement. It just doesn't always happen that way. You know, things get in the way, circumstances happen, and it sort of gets pushed to the wayside. But I'm going to tell you what happens when you don't do these things. There's often times where we've gone to customers and they'll have one single service account running the entire SharePoint enterprise, and they've been doing it since 2001. And when you try to tell them, hey, you have one service account running SharePoint completely. If something happens, if that account gets locked out or deleted or whatever, you're hosed. The response is always going to be, well, we've been doing that for 10 years now, so nothing has happened. These are the tales of what happens when those things do happen. So hopefully you can sort of prepare for those. All right, so the G word, the dreaded G word that everyone loves to throw around, but no one ever uses. I don't think I've ever been to a customer where they've had a fully fleshed out, comprehensive governance plan about literally from everything from when servers get rolled up, when new web applications get expanded, when new databases get created, what are the policies, how big of a site people can actually use, and what can they do when they're there. Never have I ever seen a completely filled out governance plan. So the root word for governance is that word, right? Actually, the root word for governance is, a little bit of history for you, is a Greek word for sort of like steering a ship or helming a ship, right? So you're guiding this whole path of where your SharePoint environment's going to be in 5 years, 10 years, if ever. And the reason why you hear this word all the time is because it really is as important as it's led on to be. And it is as detrimental when not thought through as people say it will always be. No one seems to ever get to the point where it's gotten so bad that they've said, oh, well, governance plan, we didn't have that. When you're thinking about what the governance plan is going to be, I sort of briefly talked about it. One of the big things you have to be thinking about is, you're going to be thinking about past, present, and future, where you're going to be in your environment in 5 years, 10 years. We all think about that. That's always sort of first on our mind. But we also have to think about where we've come from, what has led us to this point of implementing SharePoint, and what's the business need that we need to accomplish, and all that sort of thing. Where we are now, what we have to get accomplished to get the actual environment rolled out. The other thing we have to be thinking about is this is not going to be just a static document. And I think that's really the thing that throws off the most people right off the bat with this whole governance plan thing. Because if you look at any best practice, which we'll talk about here in a bit, the first thing that you accomplish is the business plan, the project plan, the governance plan. But quite frankly, the governance plan is never going to be complete. And if you think that it's going to be complete, and that's the point in which you can start implementing SharePoint, you've already sort of missed the boat. In addition to that, you always need to be thinking about what, again, the business need is. And Mark touched on this, and Sean actually touched on this previous session. So we've been hammering it home, so no one's ever going to be able to say in this room, no one ever told me to think about business plan first or business needs first. You need to be thinking about that, because why are you going down this road in the first place? What are you trying to accomplish? And those policies that you're enacting with SharePoint, again, very simple example such as someone's creating a new site, you need to put a policy around it. This is when the site expires, this is how much space they can have, and this is what they can put in it, and these are the owners. Right? Those very simple scenarios are the types of things you need to be thinking about at every layer of your business of folks who are actually going to be using SharePoint. Okay? And the big walk away from this one, again, being a fluid document, and you're always going to be wanting to start with the things that you need to do first. So let's think about architecture first. Let's think about what the server structure is going to be, how much money we have to spend to meet those needs. Let's think about how we're going to be doing the patching, what levels of SharePoint we're going to be doing, if you're actually even doing the patching. This all spans across multiple styles of environments as well. So it could be on-premise, it could be Office 365 or Azure or the Amazon cloud, any of those things that you're using to actually host your environment. These all are the same throughout those. And one of the things that I always like to say, from a personal level as well as from a SharePoint perspective, this is so true, right? There's 3 types of people in this world. 3 types, that's it. There's no meth heads, there's no coke dealers, there's no drug dealers or whatever, but there's 3 types of people. There's the people who are overly cautious and they never make a move. And they're costing their business X amount of dollars in revenue, and they're costing efficiency and productivity and that sort of thing. We all know those people. There's the overzealous people who don't even think about risk and they just go for it. They don't do any planning, they don't do any thought process in what the business needs and what we're trying to accomplish in the long run. They just go with it, they roll up some servers, and we figure out what it ends up being in 3 months when they call someone like myself. And then there's the baby bears, right? So you never thought coming today you'd probably hear a 3 Bears reference at all today, but I'm going to give you one. So the baby bears are, in fact, the smartest ones of all. And hopefully, from a leadership perspective, everyone in this room, we're thinking about this type of thing. Those are the people that they understand that by not doing anything, it's just as detrimental as taking a risk that you're not thinking through fully, right? So you have to sort of weigh out the cost-benefit analysis, what the risk and reward is, and you have to go at it with the information that you have. And sometimes that's not always correct, right? Sometimes the path that you take is going to be incorrect, and you need to be able to retract, pull back, and say, okay, this is the mistake that we made, and this is the direction we need to go. This is an ever-changing path. You're never going to be able to set a plan in place or project plan. That's why project plans always change. They're never met because they're always fluid, and project plans are always trying to stay within a time frame, stay within a track or that sort of thing. You have to be careful to be able to be flexible enough to move as you find out what those sort of situations are going to be. All right. So we were having a little discussion in the back about what so Mark does a couple podcasts, and he takes quotes and interviews and that sort of thing. And he asked me, what is the quote that I would always use? And if you know me on either Twitter or Facebook, you'll know that it quite often comes up that I will say, when in doubt, it's permissions. And when in doubt with SharePoint, it is always going to be permissions. So you, from an architect perspective, so the folks in the room who are implementing the solutions and not necessarily just overseeing the entire solution as a whole, but those folks who are actually building the solutions from scratch, you need to be thinking about permissions. 90% of the time, it's permissions, right? So the thing we have to be thinking about there is, I can't even tell you how many times I've been on site where I'm fixing a user profile issue because it can't synchronize, or Active Directory doesn't want to talk to the synchronization server, or the Lotus Notes connector won't work because the service account that's being used doesn't have the right permissions. When in doubt, it's always permissions from a troubleshooting perspective, right? So what do you need to take away from this, right? So what you really need to take away from the 5 bullet points we sort of talked about in the beginning is Premier costs a lot of money. Let's just be honest. To have a Premier contract, it's very expensive. To use those hours, it's very expensive. To call in a consultant, if you're consulting in a room, sorry, those hours are expensive. There's needs for those. But if you have the skill set on hand, the first thing you should be doing in any sort of situation when it comes down to troubleshooting is thinking about permissions. So we've kind of jumped a couple steps here. So let's jump back and see where we're going with this. Governance, we're talking about permissions now. So we're going down the rabbit hole of where these things are starting to be really, really important. All right, we've done permissions. We've done governance. Let's talk about architecture. So my background, so I'm not a developer. My background, well, I used to be. I guess that's pretty much every ex-developer's story, right? They used to be a developer at one point. So now I do mostly architecture, server implementation, standing up SharePoint, getting things up and rolling. So this is sort of where my niche falls in. But for the most part, when you're thinking about architecture, there's a couple really important things you need to be considering. One, where have you come from? And quite honestly, this question is not always, not always an answer to this, right? So this may be the very first implementation of SharePoint. And quite honestly, your job is harder than someone who has implemented SharePoint in the past, used it in 2003, 2007, 2010 for that factor. You sort of understand where the loopholes are, where people are falling off, where you could be focusing a lot more of your attention, but you need to understand where you've been. And if you don't have that insight, you start thinking about what the business needs are to fulfill what the architecture part of it's going to actually be. The other side of it is you really need to understand what people actually need to do in SharePoint, right? So what's this goal that we're all trying to achieve? Is it just we stand up an environment, we turn on the lights, and we expect instant collaboration, right? It's just never going to happen. One of the adoption factors is just that you need to, just by building it, they're not going to come, right? So you need to funnel people in, give them a reason to actually use SharePoint, understanding that, yes, it's going to be a new technology and there's going to be some learning curve to it, but you have to funnel people to the point where they need to make this part of their daily business activity for that adoption rate to actually happen. You need to start considering what it's going to be like in 5 years, right? So is this going to be a situation where we're standing up an environment as a proof of concept? Another one of those things for Premier, I can't tell you how many times I've seen an environment that I come in and try to fix that ended up starting as a proof of concept. That's usually the funny thing, that's the inside joke that we always have, is always a proof of concept. But what are you going to be doing with that SharePoint environment in 5 years? That's just the short-term goal, right? So it might actually take you 1 or 2 years just to get to the point where you're utilizing that investment the way you thought you were going to be using it. So now you're looking at a 3-year cycle. So what are you going to be doing in 3 years? SharePoint release schedules have been roughly every 4 to 5 years. So now you're looking at a new version of SharePoint. You really want to go that route. Now you need different security options. Do you want to go to the cloud? Do you want to offload that architecture to a different data center? All these types of things you need to be considering. Not necessarily right at the beginning when you're standing up your environment, but you need to be thinking about this long term. For the techies in the room, if you are still going through the UI to install SharePoint or to add services, add servers, whatever it might be, you're doing you and your company a huge disservice. It's funny how we've all come, right? So we started with this whole computer thing a little bit before my time. Scripting everything. Everything was scripting. My wife, she's a Solaris Unix person, so she scripts all the time. She's always giving me crap about, using the UI. And we've started to go, we went from scripting, now we went to a UI with Windows as a whole, Microsoft as a whole, and now we're reverting back. We're going back to scripting, which some of us are embracing and some of us are just gotten way too used to that next button that they can just click and hit next. But what it's going to be doing for a lot of us, it's going to be allowing us to use our time more effectively, have a repeatable process in place that when we need to stand up a new server, when we need to add a new service to that server, whatever it might be, we can just hit a button, we know the script works, and we just roll out the script. Versus going through and having the chance of that user error, putting in misinformation, hitting next when things don't need to be hit next, those sort of things. There's a lot of value that comes from scripting, and really from an organizational level, if you're not the developer in the house or the admin in the house, you need to be driving your employees to be thinking about how to use PowerShell, how to use batch files. I can't even believe I'm saying batch files in the same sentence as using SharePoint, but ultimately that's the way things are going. That's going to be, if you do end up being one of those customers that adopt cloud-style environments, whether it be dedicated on cloud environments or hybrid, on-prem and hybrid cloud initiatives, a lot of those interaction points are going to be script-based, are going to be PowerShell-based. So that's another way that we can interact with that environment and still keep going. Yeah. So you're going to pay now or you're going to pay later. But either way, you're going to pay, right? I would love to be able to sugarcoat that, but there's just no way around it. Whether you're paying a consultant to tell you the best way to do it, and hopefully backing up their credentials and making sure they know what they're talking about, whether you're just winging it and you have no idea what you're doing and you're going to push that install through, come hell or high water to meet that project plan goal, and in 3 years you're going to realize how bad it actually was. You're going to pay now or you're going to pay later. Whether you have someone from Microsoft come on, which I'm not going to push their services, or you have, again, a consultant or someone in-house, you have to hire someone to bring them in. You're going to pay now, you're going to pay later. So where do you want to pay, right? So my preference is always pay up front. I know exactly what I'm getting for my money. I'm not going to have to be reactive. We were just talking in the back about, I don't know, something stupid like $60-some or something up front for security prevents $16,000+ in 3 months to fix those types of issues that come. And that's a very security-minded statistic, but ultimately it will always cost more in the retroactive phase when you're reacting to a situation and fixing something that went wrong than it was if you just took literally 10 minutes up front to do the planning. One of the things that doesn't really get told a lot with SharePoint is the cycle of implementation for just pushing out the architecture and the services and the servers and all that good stuff. That percentage is maybe 10% of the entire process. Because if you got it to the point where you've scripted it, you know exactly how long it's going to take. So, when happy hour comes on Friday, you know it's going to take 4 hours. You can hit go down to the corner, have a drink. In 3 hours and a half, come back, you know that your SharePoint environment's about to finish up. But the majority of that implementation process for SharePoint was the planning phase, right? So that planning phase up front should be thought about when you're thinking about how much money it's actually going to take to roll out SharePoint, right? It's not going to be dollars and cents with how much a server costs or how much the licensing costs, if you can even figure out licensing. it's going to come into the planning phase, how much time you're going to put up front to make sure that all these things are in place. So when you actually hit go, and when you open this up and you open it up to all the users and you have the adoption phase of it where you're putting out little tents on the lunch tables and you're doing scavenger hunts or whatever it might be for SharePoint to have finding content and winning prizes to get people to actually start using it, hopefully you did all the planning, the 3/4 of the work to actually implement SharePoint up front. And that rolls back into architecture because you need to be thinking about that server implementation as well. One of the things that I actually just briefly want to say back on this last slide, there's a lot of talk about cloud, right? Some of us have no freaking idea what cloud even means. You know, we understand what the concept is, we understand, you know, it's a service separated from our own that we have access to, but we don't really understand the scope of what cloud is, right? So there's so many different pieces of it. This is going to be more and more prominent, whether we like it or not. And whether the adoption is minimum or, in my opinion, extreme. So if you're routing all of your information off to the cloud, and that's going to be where everything lives in 365 or SharePoint Online, or an Azure environment where you're not actually managing the environment itself, you're just managing the service on top of it, so the implementation, the install of SharePoint, and that sort of thing. Or you're going traditional on-prem. I think that it'll always be there. So the message is getting pushed one way, but make sure that you're making the decisions that's going to be best for your organization, right? Either way, I'm going to be in demand, right? So I'll be able to come and fix and do whatever, no matter where the service actually lives. That's not a problem for me. But at the end of the day, make sure that, there's a lot of decisions that are going to be made, and especially if you're rolling out SharePoint now, you have the benefit or, the consequence of knowing that you have that option available to you, and you need to be thinking about whether or not you want to actually go that route or not. So one of the most typical ways that you see cloud integration with SharePoint right now, and this is from the mouth of Microsoft, is going to be the hybrid situation where, a good example, like let's say a college, and a college has 40, 60,000 students at any given time. I have no idea how many people go to college at any one time. Another statistic totally made up. They have all these students, and they're all going to school, and they're doing their thing, and they're collaborating, and they have classes, and they have teams put aside, and they're all working on these projects. On my site would be awesome, right? But I don't want to manage all of those students. I don't want to manage all those AD accounts, and when people get locked out, I don't want to do any of that. My 5-guy team can't manage that sort of workload. So a hybrid approach where you have your My Sites in SharePoint Online that federate with your on-premise environment is just one of the most perfect ideas for using that situation, using SharePoint Online, because you don't have to manage the architecture, all the things get rolled out, you just have to do the federation, and you have the ability for your internal employees to see what's going on your external side, but not vice versa. Perfect example. I'm just trying to give you guys some insight here. So this whole Azure thing, I'm gonna give you a little tip here, just to save you a little bit of embarrassment when you're having that happy hour and you're trying to talk about cloud initiatives. So Azure rhymes with badger. Always remember that. It is not Azure or any other pronunciation. So if you take away anything from this session or anything from this day, it's going to be how to pronounce Azure. But so Azure, if you don't know what Azure is, that is, if you're familiar with like Hyper-V or VMware, where you have one really massive server or a couple big massive servers, and on those servers you have virtual OSs that are running, the virtual servers that are running, and you can spin them up and throw them away, or do whatever you need to do at any given time. Azure is kind of like that. It's VMware or Hyper-V in the cloud, this mysterious cloud that we have floating over our heads. And you have the ability to stand up VMs and do networking and that sort of thing, all off-site in someone else's data center that's geolocated anywhere in the world, and you have all that redundancy built into it. It's more expensive, but when you start thinking about how much does it cost to actually buy servers and implement servers and have the bandwidth and the data centers and the cooling for the data centers and the energy that goes into it and the guys managing it, the cost starts to sort of balance out a little bit. So if you take anything away from that, that's what Azure is. All right, Best practices. I love this term. You have no idea how many times I've been on site when someone did something they thought was best practice. So best practice is the agreed upon best method to follow the crowd blindly and do something that may be completely detrimental to your own environment or your career. That had more laughs than your Breaking Bad session. It's all right. I still don't get it. I'm going to have to go back and watch it. I literally have no idea what happened. All right. Yeah, man. So if you notice, in 2010, when we had no documentation, right, the best practice was, quite honestly, the best way to go at the time because no one knew any better. No one knew, because we didn't have any documentation, that the way to implement user profile service was X, or the way to think about governance plan and policies and retention and archiving solutions and that sort of thing was the best practice because there was no other way to do it. And people had no idea, so they sort of just went with it, right? And they're dealing with those issues as time goes on, and that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, they're not testing what they should have been testing, or they're not thinking it through what switch they're actually hitting. Right, so you have to be really careful. This is not 2009 where we didn't have any documentation. We have plenty of documentation now. In fact, one of the biggest things that we had so much trouble with in 2010, SharePoint, was the user profile service. And now, if you go to TechNet and you follow the user profile service implementation guide, even I can do it literally every time, repeatedly, and I still go by that document every single time that I roll out that service, and it works every single time. So you don't have to be thinking about best practice as, some Mark Miller's blog, right? Because there's probably not a whole lot of best practice on that. I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. I know. The hat, it's easy to see in the crowd, so you normally just get picked on. There's a lot of ways you can implement SharePoint now. There's not always, the cookie cutter way of best practice does not always mean that that's the right thing to do for you. It may not be the best thing to use claims authentication in SharePoint 2013, even though that's the way everything is going, and even though that decreases some of the functionality that you can do in your SharePoint environment. That's going to be the best practice, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the right thing for you because you might have different security needs, you might have a custom claims provider, and I'm getting a little bit too technical in that perspective, but at the end of the day, just be really careful about whenever you read this is the best practice, look at it suspiciously. The same way if anyone tells you they're a SharePoint expert, they don't exist, by the way, so look at them suspiciously as well. A lot of really, really smart people out there. No one knows the entire product from from top to bottom. So understanding what you're actually doing before you do it, and if you don't know, ask somebody. One of the good things that evolved from 2008, 2009, with the fact that we didn't have any documentation was there is a huge, vibrant community around SharePoint now. If you tweet at any given time with whatever hashtag, SP help, that's a good example. Or you go on Facebook and there's a million different groups that go to help people, or Yammer, same deal. There is usually the same way you heard about breaking news or something like that for things that are coming out in the world. You can get better, sometimes information quicker, by just sending out a quick message to somebody or using a distribution list that you have internally, whatever it might be, right? So use those communities the right way and as needed. They're going to become more and more prevalent, as you've seen with a lot of the social talks that we've talked about today. Whether you like it or not, whether you consider social to be relevant in your organization or not, chances are if you don't, you probably are thinking about social in different ways and it can be utilized in your environment. The social can be different things, any given person. Again, test what you actually have in production, or test the best practice in your test environment before you roll it to production. I think that sort of goes without saying for a lot of people, but it probably stands to be said. One of the things that I see the most often with SharePoint environments and just implementations as a whole, it is extremely expensive to have a test environment that mimics your production environment. In fact, I've seen one environment ever that was an exact duplicate of production. It just doesn't happen. It's so expensive to do. It's so tedious to maintain. It adds a whole different layer of complexity to things. At the end of the day, I've accepted the fact when I go on site that if there is a test environment, it's probably like one server or something like that that's built out just to roll code into and make sure things don't break and then roll it to production. And then the reaction type situation is usually done on production, and there's sort of a back out plan in case something goes wrong. There's no point to what I'm trying to make. All I'm trying to say essentially is if you have the ability to have a test environment closely resemble your production environment, you're doing yourself a service at the long run. So when you're thinking about, what's my planning phase and how much money I'm going to use to implement servers and that sort of thing, you need to be thinking about your test environment too, because all those best practices have a way of sneaking up on you. All right, documentation. So I know a couple people in the room that do nothing but documentation. And that's not a bad thing, right? So one of the big things that I've seen is, yeah, you've all got to that point. It's happened it's happened enough to put on this slide and actually be slightly scary that I worry about at night when I have a disaster type situation that I'm going to the next day. I can usually count on the fact that there is no documentation on how to get stuff back up. Right, so one of the things that we do from a Premier perspective is, we don't do only reactive, but some of the stuff that we do is proactive as well, where we're getting you in your thought process of thinking about these types of things, and we'll do something called like a risk assessment. And one of those risk assessment questions is, you probably have documentation, and let's hope to God it doesn't live in SharePoint. But if something does happen, who can actually use that document and do anything about it? Right, so if that's one person who just always so happens to be on vacation that week, or is in a different project or whatever it might be, do you have an entire team dedicated, or 3 or 4 guys? Where's your redundancy for the redundancy plan? Right, so not a lot of people always think about multiple servers and multiple load balancers and that whole thing, but when the S hits the fan and you need to roll back and deploy a fallout solution, who's actually going to be doing it? And do they have the knowledge, if they're an SAP guy, an Oracle guy, an Exchange guy who just so happens to be technically able to actually do these things and follow that guide, do they have a guide to actually go through and do it? One of the really, really big things, so it goes into the whole SLA thing and OLA, so operating level agreements, you have interdependencies on teams, right? So you have the AD team, you have the SharePoint team, and the database team, or maybe that's all one guy. But ultimately, you have a bunch of different people who are doing different things that affect SharePoint. And when something happens, when a ticket gets pushed through, or an outage occurs, or something like that, who is going to be responsible for that type of situation? So that's the operating level agreement. The service level agreement, obviously, we know a lot about those, and what our percentage of uptime is going to be, and where our outages and that sort of thing fall into. But with that, and how it sort of all plays back into the team that's managing that SharePoint environment, is someone has to be accountable for something. Someone has to be tied to a process or tied to a strategy or whatever it might be. One of the biggest things that I'll actually see in a lot of environments or in a lot of organizations is when something actually happens, who is accountable, and what is their accountability, and what does it actually mean for their job, right? So when you put it that way, you'd be really surprised how fast the SharePoint environment gets back up, right? So when something does go wrong, who is it that you're calling at 3 o'clock in the morning, and what are the expectations on that person? Is it literally getting up and going into the office and standing the environment back up? Is it going through and organizing this team, or offshoring, or getting Premier and they're on the next flight in the morning and that sort of thing? So make sure that you're holding accountable the people in those operating level agreements that are charged with being your SWAT team. I mean, they're the ones you trust. They're the ones that should be held accountable as well. Oh, nothing better than having a disaster recovery plan that no one's ever checked, and to see if it actually works. And then there's an outage and none of it makes sense and you can do anything about it. You're restanding SharePoint from scratch at that point. I see a couple nodding heads. Maybe that's happened to some of you. It is just the worst feeling in the world. To actually go back and say, oh, we totally have a disaster recovery plan, let's pull that out and start going through the backup, and you figure out that the configurations that were documented were like stand up our RTM release, and that was 4 years ago. And things have changed so dramatically since then. You can't recover your configuration database. You can't roll that over to a new environment. You're basically hosed. That would be a great time to have a script, drop the script in, put the install files in, run that. That'd be great to have things up and running quickly. But you see how this all sort of starts to play on top of each other. I was really tempted to do my Austin Powers voice there, but I won't. So what does this all mean, right? So how does this play back into adoption? These are the main things we see, at least personally. So permission issues, governance issues, lack of documentation, best practices are the issues that I always see when I go onto customer sites. And how does this play into adoption, right? So this is not baseball. This is not some whispering voice in a cornfield somewhere. You can't just build it and assume that everybody's going to come rushing over to SharePoint. It never works that way. So there's got to be certain levels of expectations that you're setting on your environment. What does adoption actually mean? Where's your end goal? Where are you driving toward? Is it just, you'll get so lost in the implementation of SharePoint and how you need to be doing it right, you forget about why the heck am I doing this in the first place? What am I assuming that people are going to be able to get out of this environment? What are we going to be able to use? How are they going to use SharePoint to better their jobs and make things more efficiently, make the company more money, make them, their career, expand and that sort of thing. So you have to set those expectations of what it actually means for adoption. At what point are you successful? Okay. High adoption or high consumption does not mean good adoption. It could mean really, really terrible governance. If someone's uploading video files, yeah, you're going to see your databases grow and you're going to assume there's a lot of content and a lot of collaboration. But no, it means you have a terrible governance plan if people are uploading videos. So those types of things, right? Are you flexible or are you firm in your architecture? And there's not a right answer there and there's not a wrong answer. It could be either one. Your circumstances may lend to a very firm architecture where these are the servers that we have, this is the specific job that we're trying to do, and this is what we're trying to accomplish, right? So a good example of that would be something like a services farm where you're just serving up maybe search and you're just pushing search results to other applications. So that services farm could be very stationary and firm, and there's going to be 5 servers and that's going to be it. Or you're rolling out a complete collaboration platform for your environment, and you have to assume that the 5 servers that you start with are probably going to end in 15, 20 servers, depending on adoption and that sort of thing. So that is a good problem to have, believe it or not. That means hopefully people are using the environment the way they're supposed to be using it. And the other thing, and sort of the last thing that I'll talk about from making sure that you're all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted and that sort of thing, is just make sure you know who has permissions to what. One of the compliance type situations for SOX might be something where, and I know an organization actually has to abide by this, who has permission to what and why. That last piece is the hardest point to actually cover. It's easy just to roll out permissions to people. Someone hits a site and they get access denied and they request permissions and that sort of thing, and it's easy just to give them permissions, but why do they need those permissions? And if you need to recall why they were asking for permissions and why you gave it to them, you might not be able to do that in a UI-based situation where you might have to script it and that sort of thing. But ultimately, who has permissions to what and who can do what? That may mean service accounts. That may mean site administrators or farm administrators or site owners. All these people, you're going to find really quickly that permissions get jumbled up very quick in SharePoint. And it's hard to manage and hard to understand where things are and how they line up and who still has permissions to what, and oh, this person left the company, or now they're the CEO or something like that. We need to upgrade all their permissions and that sort of thing. So manage your permissions from the very beginning as well. I think that was pretty much the fastest way that I can tell you what not to do in the history of any time I've ever done any kind of talking. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into my day and why you may not want that job. By the way, we are hiring. Yeah, I think we're actually doing questions, right? Are we doing a couple questions after the fact? Yeah, so I'll give them a few seconds to come up. So hopefully that was enjoyable, maybe not enjoyable, but enlightening or eye-opening. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Eric. Well, I think that, I don't know about you, but I'm getting hungry. And I see that lunch is ready. So I won't take up much of your time, but I would like to ask you to join me in our final big round of applause for all the speakers. They've been great. And I hope that you each leave here today having learned a great deal, and that you return to your respective organizations to put in what you've learned here today. In part to help you do just that, Bamboo has agreed for a parting gift for each of you, and I think it's laying on the table just when you exit the room. So make sure that you stop by and collect your gift from one of our staff. Other than that, let me just say thank you for joining us here at the SharePoint Leadership Forum 2013, and that I look forward to seeing you again on next year's event. Thank you.